There is a moment in late 1944, deep in the forests of the Ardennes, when the war changes shape entirely. It's not because of strategy, not because of reinforcements, but because the temperature collapses to levels the human body was never designed to endure. Men who had survived artillery barrages and machine gun fire suddenly found themselves losing fingers, toes, and sometimes their lives, without ever seeing the enemy. Rifles jammed from ice, boots hardened overnight. Soldiers woke up unable to feel their own hands. Entire units became ineffective not from combat but from exposure. And what made it worse was the confusion. These weren't untrained recruits. They were equipped, disciplined, and prepared, yet something invisible was dismantling them piece by piece. The unsettling truth is this: the deadliest threat wasn't the cold alone. It was how the human body reacted to it, and how poorly that reaction was understood. Some men endured the same conditions and walked away intact. Others, standing beside them in identical gear, ended up evacuated with severe frostbite. The difference came down to a small, almost absurd adjustment that spread quietly across the front lines. It didn't involve advanced equipment. It didn't require new technology. It required understanding a simple principle that most people instinctively get wrong. And once you grasp it, you'll realize how many modern cold weather mistakes still follow the same flawed logic today. It's the story of how soldiers learned to stop fighting the cold and started working with it. At the time, military planners believed they had winter clothing figured out. Wool was the gold standard. It insulated well, retained warmth when damp, and had proven itself across multiple campaigns. On paper, it should have been enough. But winter warfare in Northern Europe exposed a flaw no one had fully accounted for. The issue wasn't just external cold, it was internal moisture. Even in freezing conditions, the human body continues to produce sweat. It's not the kind that drips or soaks through clothing immediately, but a constant, subtle vapor. It's part of how the body regulates temperature. Under normal circumstances, that moisture moves outward through layers of fabric and evaporates. In subzero conditions, that process breaks down. As the vapor travels outward through gloves or boots, it encounters progressively colder air. At a certain point, it reaches its condensation threshold. The moisture turns into liquid and then almost instantly freezes. Ice begins to form inside the insulation itself. That changes everything. Instead of trapping warm air, the insulation becomes saturated with frozen moisture. And frozen water conducts heat away from the body far more efficiently than air ever could. What was supposed to protect you becomes a conduit for heat loss. This explains a phenomenon many people have experienced without fully understanding. You work hard in the cold, walking, digging, hiking, and initially feel warm, and suddenly, the chill sets in deeper than before. That's the moment your own moisture has turned against you. During the winter campaigns of the Second World War, this wasn't just uncomfortable. It was devastating. Once insulation froze, it stayed frozen. And once it stopped insulating, the body had no defense left. The harder a soldier worked, the faster the process accelerated. At some point, necessity forced a shift in thinking. Soldiers, field engineers, and cold weather specialists began to recognize a counterintuitive truth. If moisture was the problem, then trying to let it escape in extreme cold was a losing strategy. Instead, they tried something radically different. They trapped it. This became known as the vapor barrier principle. And despite its simplicity, it marked one of the most effective survival adaptations of the war. The setup was straightforward. A thin inner layer sat directly against the skin. Its job was minimal, just enough to prevent friction and absorb initial moisture. Over that came a completely non-breathable barrier, often made of rubber or treated fabric. On top of everything, a thick insulating layer provided warmth. The key was that the barrier stopped moisture from ever reaching the insulation. At first, the idea seemed wrong. Sealing in sweat feels like the opposite of what you should do. It creates a damp, enclosed environment that most people would instinctively avoid. But in extreme cold, it works. Once the air inside that sealed space reaches full humidity, the body reduces its rate of sweating. There is nowhere for the moisture to go, so the system stabilizes. More importantly, the outer insulation remains completely dry. And dry insulation retains its full ability to trap heat. What soldiers discovered was remarkable. This simple barrier could significantly increase warmth without adding bulk or weight. More importantly, it prevented the gradual freezing process that had been destroying standard gear from the inside. It wasn't comfortable in the traditional sense, but it was effective, and in those conditions, effectiveness was all that mattered. The theory alone didn't save lives. It was the people on the ground, often improvising under pressure, who turned it into practice. Medics during the winter campaigns saw the consequences of failure up close. Frostbite cases weren't just injuries, they were irreversible turning points. Once tissue froze deeply enough, recovery became unlikely. Amputations followed. Entire futures changed in a matter of hours. There were moments when officers demanded that injured men return to the front. But those who truly understood cold injury knew better. Sending a frostbitten soldier back into the field wasn't reinforcement. It was a guarantee of permanent damage. In parallel, soldiers from northern regions brought their own experience into play. Finnish troops, for example, had long operated in extreme winter environments. Their methods were simple but precise. They rotated bootliners regularly, ensuring one set was always drying while another was in use. They used natural materials like moss or straw to improve airflow and absorb moisture. They understood that managing moisture was just as important as maintaining warmth. These weren't high-tech solutions. They were practical responses built on observation and repetition. And they worked. The difference between those who adapted and those who didn't was stark. One group preserved mobility and function. The other gradually lost both. As the scale of cold-related casualties became impossible to ignore, military engineers began redesigning equipment based on these field lessons. This led to the development of fully sealed cold-weather boots, later known informally as Mickey Mouse boots, and their successors. These boots abandoned the idea of breathability entirely. Instead, they functioned as airtight systems, preventing moisture from entering the insulation. The design was extreme by conventional standards. Layers were sealed within rubber shells. Air valves were included to manage pressure changes at altitude. Everything about the system prioritized isolation over ventilation, and it worked. Even decades later, similar designs are still used in environments where temperatures drop below -40 degrees. At those extremes, breathable materials often fail for the same reason they did during the war. Moisture escapes, freezes, and compromises insulation. The lesson remained unchanged. In deep cold, managing moisture is more important than releasing it. This isn't just a historical curiosity. The same physics applies every time you step into a cold environment. If you've ever felt your feet grow colder after prolonged activity, you've encountered the early stages of the same problem. If your gloves or socks become damp and stay that way, you're already on the path toward heat loss. The solution doesn't require specialized gear. It requires understanding. Simple vapor barrier can be improvised using everyday materials. A thin plastic layer, placed between an inner liner and an outer insulating layer, can replicate the same principles soldiers relied on decades ago. It keeps insulation dry and stabilizes the microclimate around your skin. But it has to be used correctly. Extended exposure to trapped moisture can soften the skin and lead to other issues if not managed properly. Liners need to be changed. Skin needs to be dried periodically. Awareness is essential. This is not a shortcut. It's a system. And like any system, it depends on how well you apply it. Looking back at those winter campaigns, one pattern becomes clear. Survival didn't belong to the strongest or the best equipped. It belonged to those who understood what was happening around them and inside their own bodies. The cold didn't change. The environment didn't become more forgiving. What changed was the approach. Those who adapted their methods walked out of conditions that incapacitated others. Not because they had better gear, but because they used it differently. The distinction still matters. The next time you're in a cold environment and you feel that gradual loss of warmth, the question to ask isn't how thick your insulation is. It's whether it's still dry. Because once moisture takes hold, thickness becomes irrelevant. The soldiers who endured those winters left behind more than stories. They left behind a practical understanding of how to survive when conditions turn hostile. If you take anything from this, let it be that knowledge carries weight even when your pack doesn't. It's the one tool that doesn't wear out, doesn't freeze, and doesn't fail when you need it most. If you found this breakdown valuable and want more deep dives into real survival lessons pulled straight from history? Make sure you subscribe to the channel and share this with someone who takes the outdoors seriously.